Hello, everyone, and welcome to this amazing panel discussion on Phoenix parking reform, an informational panel discussion on the impacts of parking requirements on our communities and what can be done. And thank you for joining. This panel discussion is hosted by the Urban Phoenix Project and presented to you in collaboration with the Parking Reform Network. We are recording this webinar and hope to provide this recording on our website and via email to those registered. Hi, my name is Nicole Rodriguez. I apologize for not having my camera on. I'm having technical difficulties. It may come on at one point. Brief introduction, I'm a Phoenician. I'm an Urban Phoenix board member and a community advocate. Today, I'm your host and moderator for our panel discussion. But before we begin the discussion, we would like to give you a brief introduction of what parking requirements and reform are. We have Tony Jordan here with us today, president of the Parking Reform Network, who will be providing this brief introduction and joining the panelists in today's discussion. Following his introduction, I will be introducing our panelists for the day and before we kick off the discussion. And if you are having any technical difficulties, you met Chelsea already, so she will be helping you with any of those situations that arise and paying attention to the chat for any questions that we may have time to answer later on. And once again, thank you for joining today, and we hope you find this informative, enlightening, and helpful. And with that, Tony, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Let me just get my items set up here. So you should be seeing my slide. And I think I can change my slide. Okay, hopefully this is around 10 minutes. I'm gonna cover, so my name's Tony Jordan. Thank you, Nicole. I'm the founder and president of the Parking Reform Network. I live in Portland, Oregon. And I have been working on parking policy reform for the last 15 years, something like that, a while. 13 years, not 15. And I founded Parking Reform Network in 2019. I'm gonna try and go through these pretty quick. It's gonna be a lot of info, but hopefully it will be informative and spark some discussion for the talk. Hold on, I just move a couple things out of my way and make sure I can change slides. Okay, so real quick, what is the Parking Reform Network? We are an organization that is a community of practitioners, activists, journalists, advocates, elected officials. We have over 500 members around the world, mostly in the United States. We provide research, education, and advice, including presentations like this, to cities and other municipalities that are looking to change their parking policies. And we're an action-based organization, advocacy and focused on looking at all issues, equity, economic impact, and all the issues that parking policy impacts, which is a lot. A quick warning, if you haven't heard about these kinds of things, if you never thought deeply about parking policy, this might really change the way you see the world. It's a bit like in They Live when Roddy Piper puts on these glasses and sees the world is kind of run by alien monsters. I can't look at a parking lot anymore and not see the cost, the space it takes up, the what used to maybe have been there before and what could possibly be there in the future. So why did I get into parking and what is the issue with parking policy? Parking is expensive, it takes up a lot of space, and we've required a lot of it for many, many years. And the result has been higher rents, kind of sprawly environments, urban heating and flooding problems, and higher prices just that we pay in all sorts of things. The problem kind of starts with these things called parking mandates or parking requirements. And what these are relatively arbitrary ratios for every time you want to start a business, or if you want to build an apartment or any kind of building, your city or county is going to require that you build a certain number of parking spaces in most jurisdictions. These ratios, just to give an example of a particular, they're for all sorts of land uses, and we're going to look at, for one of my favorite, bowling alleys. So if you want to build a bowling alley in Maricopa County, in Surprise, you need to build 2 parking spaces per lane. In Carefree, you need 1 per 300 square feet. Peoria, 2 per lane and 1 for every 5 visitor seats. Fountain Hills, 4 per lane. Glendale, it's 4 per lane, but if you have a bar that has a separate entrance, you have to build more parking spaces. Mesa, 5 per lane. And Phoenix actually it's kind of complicated. I think it's an assembly area. It's hard to tell, actually. The code is a little complex. And the impact here is these are all places that are nearby, near your city. And what is the possible difference between a bowler in Surprise versus a bowler in Mesa, or one in Carefree versus Glendale? Like these ratios, do people carpool in one place and not in another? Given that these require a lot more space, a bowling alley of the higher requirement will require a lot more space to build. Is Mesa trying to discourage bowling alleys from being built? The real answer is that no one knows. These are pretty arbitrary ratios. Back in the 50s, planners and developers were trying to build shopping areas and didn't know how much parking to build. They couldn't agree, so they would just build some. And as this planner in 1954 said, we would guess a number of stalls, and invariably it's either too many or not enough. And then these got put in the zoning code. So another quick example, I'm not going to go one for one, but is funeral homes in the area of Maricopa County. Wickenburg, 1 per 500 square feet of floor area. Scottsdale, 1 per 2 seats, plus 1 per 30 square feet. Phoenix is, I think, 1 per 4 seats and 1 per 60 square feet, depending on the land use you're picking. Like Scottsdale to Wickenburg is like a 13 or 14 times difference in the amount of parking you would have to require if you were providing a funeral home to the community. And once again, what could possibly justify this difference? These are truly arbitrary numbers that were made up and locked in. It's kind of a joke, but you might have better luck using tarot cards or reading bird guts to do these things, but they get codified and they're very hard to change for a long time. And the impact is sprawl and extra costs and car dependency. They're roughly right, roughly wrong. I've given a couple examples, but you have things like go-kart tracks, 2 spaces per two per cart in Phoenix. Gilbert has a parking requirement for haunted houses. There's a place in Woodbury, Georgia that has, you have to have an algebra degree to figure out 0.26 per student and 1.2 per employee. They have heliports, helipads. We've got parking for parking. Tolleson has a parking requirement for drive-in movie theaters, which is a land use no one is really making. And if you were making a drive-in movie theater, do you need to tell people they have to have 1 for every parking space where a car is going to be? And we've even found around the country parking requirements for parking garages. And I know that these aren't specifically local to your city, but if you go look at your own city zoning code, there are a bunch of land uses with very arbitrary requirements in them. And just to put the cherry on top, SeaTac Washington, I came across this years ago. They have a parking requirement for moth and butterfly breeding facilities, but they don't have one for ant farms or worm buckets. This is kind of amusing when you look at it one for one, but the impact has been really profound. There's a cycle of, if you're building a bunch of parking spaces, it's difficult to build transit. It's difficult to make places that are walkable. It's difficult to build the type of housing that density that supports those uses. And so we end up with places that are spread apart and difficult to visit, and we don't necessarily want to hang out. There's also a true cost, the real cost. A parking space on the surface lot, not counting land, is thousands of dollars per space to build, depending on how much landscaping. Above ground, we're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. And remember that a $40,000 parking space is going to add $400 or so to the cost of rent per month. Below ground, you're doubling the cost generally of an above ground parking space. And these are real trade-offs. You can afford, we can choose to build parking and storing cars. This is in Stamford, Connecticut, park and ride facility, 900 parking spaces, $88,000 per car. In the same city, there's a deeply affordable housing complex with no parking, by the way, that was built for $9 million. It houses about 120 people, $77,000 per person. So when you really compare the amount it costs to build parking spaces sometimes and to house actual people, we're making a trade-off and a decision to do that. The space is really important. A parking space takes up 300 to 400 square feet. So you have to decide, do you want living space or parking space, right? 1.5 to 2 parking spaces is going to take up the same space as a small apartment. And so often the limiting factor on how much housing can be built on a site is not the zoning, it's actually how much parking a developer can fit on the site. It's important to look at these numbers in context. When you think about that 2 spaces per apartment, and then you look at the ACS, the American Census data on how many cars people own in Maricopa County, all households, 4.8% own no cars, but 33% one car, 39.9% two cars. But among renters, 10% of the households own no cars, 45.6% own one car, and 32.8% own two cars. So 88% of renters in the county own two or few cars per household. But when you look at the parking requirements for housing in the county, you see that in Wickenburg, which has pretty low parking requirements, you're already requiring more parking than half the renters own for cars. Mesa, you're going above what 88% of renter households need for parking. And these are simple ones. We get into this. I don't expect you to read this slide, but it just goes to show I have to shrink the numbers down and abbreviate, because when you start looking at like Phoenix or Tempe or Queen Creek's parking requirements, like they're very specific. 1.5 for a 1-bedroom, 2.2 for a 2-bedroom, 2 for a 3-bedroom. And when you think specifically about the lack of housing for families in our cities that we're seeing, like it's a common refrain, why don't we build more multifamily housing? Why don't we build more housing that's for family size units? If you're requiring 3 or 4 parking spaces for a renter household that probably owns one, you're not going to be able to build housing that people can afford or need in your community. So there is a solution. This guy, Professor Shoup, 40 years ago, started talking about how to solve this problem. And there's a 3-step program. You get rid of your parking mandates. You just they're really hard to change. There's not a number that's right. You should get rid of them. Price your curbs. The city manages the curbs for occupancy and use the money to reduce car dependency. The first one is happening. This map is out of date. There's more than 50 cities in North America, big cities, small cities, cities in hot places and cold places, cities in blue states and red states, all over the place, good transit, no transit, that have gotten rid of parking mandates, and the sky hasn't fallen. The city should mind its own business when it comes to parking, and that means manage the curb, monitor and manage the curb spaces so that as new buildings come online and people park on the street, you can use simple things like permits and meters to manage that, and people will build the parking in their apartments or in their businesses. The right price is the lowest price that leaves a space open on every block. It's a data-driven process. It actually improves commerce most places. And you can spend that money on things like sidewalks, crosswalks, better lighting, bus shelters, etc. Real quick, what happens when you do this? First thing, nothing. If you get rid of your parking mandates in Phoenix tomorrow, the city will be the same city as today. If you go look at a Google map, there's a lot of parking in the city. It's still going to be there. So if you're building new housing, people who have cars beyond what will probably be built anyway can most likely find a parking space to rent. In cities that have done this in the past, Seattle and Buffalo have been studied because they did it about 6 years ago. You got more housing. That is definitely true. The housing that was built since then would not have been legal to build under the previous parking requirements, but most buildings still included parking in them because the stars have to align for a bunch of housing to be built without parking in the first place. You need a developer that wants to build it, a bank that will lend, a broker that will sell. You need a parcel that works with some transit or accessibility. So it's not like this isn't a big, it's not going to overnight switch and change. So that's my quick and dirty introduction to parking requirements and parking reform. I'm Tony Jordan. You can find me at parkingreform.org. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Tony. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. I got my camera finally working, so now folks could see me. I'm going to kick it off here with our panel discussion. We have a few questions, and we're still doing good on time. We got 4 panelists, and I'm going to go ahead and do a brief introduction. If our panelists don't already have their cameras on, if you could turn your camera on if it's working for you. But I'll start off with Dan Klocke. He's a senior development project manager at Gorman and Company. And Dan joined Gorman and Company to help manage the company's continued growth in the Arizona market. Previously, he worked with the Downtown Phoenix Partnership for 17 years, serving as the executive director for 4. And Dan began working with the partnership to oversee the Downtown Phoenix Community Development Corporation, a nonprofit affiliate which sought to out potential affordable housing developments. Dan has extensive experience working closely with local governments and boards of directors to coordinate development strategies for affordable housing communities. He has often served as a sounding board with residents and community stakeholders to strategize innovative ways to build affordable housing into existing neighborhoods, which simultaneously serves as a catalyst for revitalization. And next we have Kirin Goff. She is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Arizona, Mellon. Might get this wrong, but the Anid Zuckerman College of Public Health and director of the Applied Health Policy Institute. Apologies, Kirin, if I didn't get that right. You can let me know later.
No worries.
She is most interested in how the built environment impacts health, well-being, and social participation. This includes issues such as housing, zoning, transportation, and heat. Kirin is a public health lawyer. Before joining the university, she worked as a political lawyer at a local law firm and drafted health regulations for the Arizona Department of Health Services. She also has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's degree in global health. And next we have Representative Analise Ortiz. She is an Arizona State Representative and proudly serves the people of Maryville and Glendale in Legislative District 24. Ortiz serves as the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. Ortiz was born and raised in Arizona and grew up in a family of 6 kids. Ortiz graduated summa cum laude from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University and pursued a career in investigative reporting. Ortiz's journalism career exposed harmful legislation and uncovered government corruption, inspiring her to get involved in legislative advocacy. Ortiz has been impacted directly by unaffordable rent increases, barriers to home ownership, and exploitative practices by landlords. During Ortiz's first legislative session in 23, this past year, she championed zoning reform legislation and successfully negotiated a historic investment into housing and homelessness in the state budget. And last but not least, we have Ed Hermes. He's an attorney and community advocate who currently serves as the president of the school board for the Osborn School District in Central and Uptown Phoenix. As a board member, Ed has focused on ensuring a quality public education and a healthy environment for all kids, which includes creating safe routes for kids to walk and bike to school. And in 2023, Ed was appointed by the City of Phoenix Council to serve on the Vision Zero State Streets Committee, where he works to change street design and policies to reduce to zero the seriousness of deaths and injuries caused by vehicle traffic. Ed, along with his wife, Mariana, and 2 daughters, Penelope and Valentina, live in the Carnation neighborhood of Phoenix. In his day job, Ed is a partner at the law firm Snell & Wilmer, where his legal practice focuses on economic development in the Indian country and state and local law, tax law. So thank you and welcome. And I'm going to go ahead and open up with one of our first questions we have today. And thank you guys for also, I see a lot of great comments in the chat. It's been putting a lot of smiles on my face. And at any point, it seems like we have a lot of advocates, but play devil's advocate at any point you want to and ask some questions that we may have thought of if we do have time later. So with our first question, we have, now go ahead and if we have, Kirin, if you want to go ahead and start off with this, what is the connection between parking requirements, increased housing costs, and the overall affordability of housing?
Absolutely. So first of all, he talked at the beginning, he did a great job of illustrating how much a parking space costs and how arbitrary these requirements are. And if you think about it, it's actually kind of understandable that the mechanisms by which we decide how much parking we have are kind of unscientific and arbitrary because it's hard to figure out how much you need of a lot of things. The problem is that our policy mechanisms for providing it make it really hard to adjust when you build the wrong amount. We sort of treat parking like infrastructure, but it's not like other infrastructure where there's some central agency who's managing it and adjusting it, looking at the system as a whole and being able to respond to our needs. So parking minimums are kind of this bizarre public policy space because the way that we provide and finance them in effect creates a parking subsidy, but this is achieved not through a direct subsidy through the government, but actually through requiring private sector actors to provide that infrastructure. So he did a great job of illustrating how expensive a parking spot is. It varies a lot from place to place, study to study, but we know that it's very expensive, in the ballpark of oftentimes hundreds of dollars a month. And that cost is essentially subsidized through higher prices for everything that we buy. So we're talking mostly today about the residential space, but this is also true when you go to a restaurant or a retail establishment or really anywhere. That cost is baked into basically the cost of living for everything that we buy, which makes it so that it's very hard to unbundle it and make decisions based on whether or not the cost of parking is worth it to you. And in effect, actually kind of it increases the cost of other modes because you've already have the sunk cost of parking. And so from a public policy perspective, I would certainly question parking minimums as a policy strategy at all. But on top of that, we know that if we're going to have parking minimums, we now know that they, certainly in Phoenix, significantly overestimate the demand for parking. So the low-hanging fruit here is to say, okay, I'm a realist. We're not going to be able to revamp our entire policy paradigm overnight, but let's at least try to eliminate some of these spaces that aren't used. And in the housing space, this can actually be quite rewarding because a lot of work in the built environment or environmental space is much more indirect, right? How something impacts climate change or whatever. But what's nice about parking policy is that some of the benefits can be quite direct, that if you eliminate or reduce parking minimums, then developers can actually go ahead and build sites that they wouldn't otherwise be able to build, and people can have lower rents as a result. And this gives developers flexibility because they can choose to do things like charge tenants less rent because their costs are lower, or unbundle the cost of parking by charging for parking and that sort of thing. So sorry, long answer, but it's a big topic.
No, that was great. And you led me to think about like infill projects for smaller projects. And I wanted to, Dan, with your background in affordable housing, if you don't mind also chiming in on this and kind of giving your 2 cents on that perspective.
Sure, happy to. So Kirin talked about it sort of from the 30,000 foot level. I want to talk about nuts and bolts, what the true cost is. So if a parking space, it varies a little bit from city to city depending on the dimensions, but roughly you need about 275 to 300 square feet for a parking space. That includes the half of the drive aisle behind the car. So what does that translate to? What does that really mean? So if I'm buying land really cheaply at $10 a square foot, and then I'm paving it and putting in curb and gutter for the parking lot, that translates to roughly $6,000 a space. So if I'm forced to build 100 extra parking spaces or 70 extra parking spaces or whatever, that's real money. 100 is $600,000. So if you're trying to build affordable housing and you're being forced to build extra parking spaces that no one ever uses, then you're just simply costing the developer money that he has to find more subsidy for. And so giving the flexibility, because it does vary from project to project, giving the flexibility to the developer can save money, can allow for the money to go into other uses and to help subsidize a project so that rent is at a lower level.
Thank you. And I think with the time that we have, I may go ahead and jump to the next question I wanted to ask you guys, but Representative Ortiz and Ed, please at any time, you could readdress some of the questions we already bypassed. But I wanted to segue with you, Dan, with the next question is, is there any upcoming legislation efforts aimed at parking reform And what can members here today of the community do to get involved and support these initiatives? And you and I, Dan, were at quite a few of those Village Planning Committee meetings, advocating and providing public comments on parking reform. And Representative Ortiz and Ed were at the Planning Commission along with you and I. We heard a lot of different things there as well as far as opposition. And I just wanted to kind of hear from you also, what's coming up, if you could tell everybody what's coming up here in Phoenix for parking reform and to help folks kind of understand what they could do to get involved. And if you want, by all means, kind of discuss some of those opposition points. And any of y'all, please go ahead and jump in, Kirin and Ed and Representative Ortiz.
I'll hold off since I just spoke. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, sure. First, I want to say thank you, Nicole, for the question, and thank you for organizing this. This took a lot of work. This is really important, and I really appreciate you pulling this together, and it's a wonderful turnout. And I see a lot of folks from a lot of different areas of our community, and including folks from our city, which is wonderful. So to answer your question, I like to look at things from a historical lens. And so I'm going to back up to some of that here in a bit. But right now, this is a crucial time for this parking reform. On September 6th, the City Council is going to be considering it is a zoning ordinance text amendment Z-TA-8-23-Y. Maybe somebody can type that in the chat. I say that out loud so that people know, because it is crucial that everyone, and get your friends, get your community to email your city council people to say that we want this text amendment passed as it was intended and developed by city staff. Kudos to city staff from the city of Phoenix who put a lot of work in, and to community advocates, and especially Nicole, who put a lot of work into this text amendment, and including some of the city council folks as well, to develop a great text amendment. I was there at the commission meeting, as well as Representative Ortiz and others. It went to midnight talking about this issue that we're talking about today. I won't take that long trying to answer the question, but there's a lot of different viewpoints on it. We can talk about how to kind of address some of those issues, but right now is a critical time in our city to make some baby steps in progress by passing this text amendment, which is going to eliminate the parking mandatory minimums for affordable housing. That's one of the items that it does, as well as ease some of the mandatory minimums for other uses for housing. Now, I see this as a long line of reforms that the city is starting to do. The Walkable Urban Code is another one that affects me. One of the other in my district on the school board, it's mostly in the Walkable Urban Code, as well as where I live. You can see how the reduction in mandatory minimum parking spaces has allowed more development in that walkable urban corridor along the light rail. This is going to, by passing this text amendment, if the city does it, especially if the city does it as intended by city staff and as developed by city staff, it's going to, as the city staff themselves said, it's going to get these parking mandatory minimums out of the way to unlock the potential of building more housing, especially more affordable housing in our city, which we so desperately need. So I'll stop there, but please do, if you get nothing else from today, please do contact your representatives on the city council and ask them to vote yes, and especially as the staff amended it. I'm sorry, as the staff proposed it, not as the planning commission kind of tinkered with it and made it worse. So I'll stop there and let others speak.
Thanks, Ed. Representative Ortiz, can you chime in on this one? I'd love to get your perspective too, and especially what we heard that night at the Planning Commission, if you want to share.
Yes, it was very interesting at the Planning Commission. We had more supporters than people in opposition who came out to testify in support of reducing these arbitrary parking requirements. There is data that shows it will reduce rent. There is data that shows it is better for the environment. And all of those kind of the evidence-based decisions kind of went out the window in favor of emotions-based arguments that were being brought to the Planning and Zoning Commission, which was really disappointing. We should always be making our decisions decisions from a data-driven perspective. And to be honest, this reduction of the parking requirements is one of the lowest hanging fruit type of policies that we should have passed several years ago to be where we need to be on housing, development, walkability, and sustainability for our communities. So I still have some hope and optimism here. We need to make sure we turn out to the council meeting on September 6th, and we really make it clear to the city council that the support is out there. And I just want to give a couple of real world examples. I was at a conference just last week hearing from Native American Connections, a nonprofit developer. Many of their complexes are 100% affordable. They were talking about a transitional living complex in Phoenix, which is a place where people can go from homelessness into housing and can kind of get their stability and get back on their feet. In that complex, the city of Phoenix's parking requirement mandated 93 parking spaces. Guess how many residents of that complex currently have cars? Only 12 of them. So it does not make sense for us to have arbitrary parking requirements when these decisions should be based on data, on the developer and the architect working together with the service provider and the nonprofit who understands their population best, right? They understand the residents and what their needs are. And a bank is not going to finance a project that does not have parking, right? There always is going to be that consideration of how much parking is really needed. And all we're asking for is for that decision to be rooted in evidence and facts. A second point that I want to make is a conversation I had with an architect not too long ago who designed a complex on 19th Avenue and Northern. It is, again, a 100% affordable living complex run by Catholic Charities. And in the development and design of that process, the architect really wanted to have green space and a big park where the children who lived in the complex could have a space to run around and call their own, and more trees and shade. Because of Phoenix's parking requirements, they needed to cut down significantly the size of the park in order to put parking spaces. And as the architect was telling me this, we were standing there in the parking lot, all of the stalls around us were empty. So this is the reality. This is the harm that these parking requirements have. And the last thing I want to touch on is the statewide legislation that we can introduce next year. So right now we're on a break from the legislative session. We go back in January. Last year, I sponsored a bill, HB 2721, which would have instructed cities to reduce parking requirements for affordable housing complexes. This bill language was the result of a compromise with the Arizona League of Cities and Towns. The League of Cities and Towns is a lobbying entity that represents all 91 cities and towns in the state, and they have been our primary opponent to affordable housing legislation at the state level. So we worked out this compromise, and the bill did not receive a hearing. Now we see the city of Phoenix taking initiative on their own, right? But it has been a battle. It has been, we've seen opposition coming from the city. We have city council people who are continuing to waver on whether they will actually vote yes on this parking reduction. And so to me, this signals that if we fail at the city of Phoenix to do something on, again, a very low-hanging fruit ask here, next year at the legislature, we are going to have to come back with a statewide piece of legislation around parking. And I am going to have to really seriously consider about what kinds of compromises we are going to make with the League of Cities and Towns, because if they are not getting their cities to act and do the right thing on their own, then we're going to have more aggressive legislation at the state level.
Thank you. And you brought up something about the arbitrary parking requirements and the excessive amount of parking that was required in a couple different situations and scenarios where it's not meeting the actual demand, which is a lot lower, as we know, than what was required for them to develop. With that, sometimes we get questions about, well, you could get a permit to reduce the parking, and but that red tape comes with costs as well. And so, Dan, I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate about that and the red tape that if a developer were to attempt to reduce parking based on the current requirements, how that impacts the
Sure.
overall development as well.
Sure. As an affordable housing builder, sometimes we're not welcomed into cities with open arms. There may be some folks that aren't real excited about us being there. It's just part of the business. It's not. It's just life. But what has happened at times is that when you do need to have variances or use permits, they can be used in a way that can stop a project. And so if somebody really doesn't want an affordable housing project, they can use parking, traffic, impact on schools. There's a lot of these different things that get tossed around, which basically circle back to, I don't want affordable housing in my neighborhood. And so that is used on a regular basis by residents who understand the nuances of how to stop things. And so, yeah, it has a big impact, especially depending on the city that you're in.
Yeah, and we saw that quite a bit also at the village planning committees as well, which is an interesting topic for another time too, just on the makeup of those village planning committees. But one of the things I wanted to kind of change gears on, because this is one of the questions we had today, and I've seen it in the chat here as well, is on urban heat, right? And then we have maybe time for another question or two. But for urban heat, my question and Kirin, if you wouldn't mind kicking this off with your response. Question is, urban heat is a significant concern in Phoenix. How does the current parking infrastructure contribute to this issue? And how can parking reform be leveraged to mitigate urban heat effects?
Heat is something that myself and my colleague are very passionate about. One thing that I find frustrating is that people talk about extreme and increasing heat like it's inevitable or like it's just the result of climate change, and they feel kind of defeated. But it's actually much more directly, acutely preventable and reversible than people realize. So my understanding is that the best estimate is that the heat island in Phoenix has actually contributed to the increasing in temperatures that we've seen more than climate change. And parking is a big part of that. In the summer, the Phoenix sun, the pavement radiates about 46% more heat than the natural landscape. Asphalt surface temperatures can rise to over 175 degrees in the summer sun. And people often actually get contact burns when they fall on hot pavement in Phoenix. So from a policy perspective, one thing that we can do is reduce the amount of parking that we require. We can also do things that make it easier and more enjoyable to do things like ride bikes and other modes instead of driving. We desperately need to increase our tree canopy. And then my team has also been looking into some other potential policy solutions when it comes to asphalt and pavement. We're at the beginning stages, but one thing that we've been researching is whether it's feasible to actually depave some lower traffic surfaces. So for example, in parking lots, providing the actual parking spaces as like a dustproof gravel surface, or even we don't think about this a lot, but a lot of our parking is on street parking, particularly on residential streets. And our residential streets are actually quite wide, in part because they allow for on-street parking on both sides. Those are areas that don't get a lot of traffic. So how feasible would it be, for example, to depave the sides of the street with a dustproof surface, plant some trees, still allow for parking and emergency vehicle turnaround and that kind of thing, but kind of for the parking that we do have, decrease some of these surfaces that contribute the worst to the heat island. So again, we're still kind of at the beginning stages of exploring some of these policy options. And one interesting thing is that we haven't really been able to find other cities that have done that sort of thing at any kind of scale. So this could be a space where we could be a leader in how to make a hot desert city more livable. But I'm really genuinely scared for the future of Phoenix. We might be the fastest growing county in the country now, but it could only take a few degrees and some bad publicity to reverse that. And what happens if we start quickly losing population, like what happened to Detroit several decades ago? This stuff keeps me up at night.
Mm-hmm. Nicole, if I could just add on to that, I think that's your question is very important, because we have to start seeing all of these issues that's intertwined, and especially the heat island effect. And working on this issue in the text amendment, you heard, it seems like some folks have a kind of a visceral reaction to reducing the mandatory minimums. And my working theory is, so people go to that place at that time, maybe once in the last year or something like that, where you try to find a parking spot and you couldn't find it, and oh no, and that's what people kind of dwell on and think about, and that negative experience perhaps when changing these mandatory minimums. But what we need to be thinking about is the deleterious effects that these mandatory minimums have been created on our community and our society in the last 60 years or so, which is these massive unused parking lots that are creating this huge heat island effect, which is, empty buildings. If you go to, especially in our kind of historic areas, I live in the kind of Melrose area, you see a lot of unused buildings. I talk to those business owners and the property owners, and they say, we can't develop them because we can't meet the mandatory minimum parking requirements here. And so these buildings sit empty and they get dilapidated, or they say, we have to buy up that nearby housing, bulldoze it, the house nearby, to create a parking lot, and making our housing problem even worse. So we've got to talk about this issue comprehensively, so that when people are thinking about it, they don't envision, what if I can't find a parking spot? It's, what if we don't do this? How is it going to exacerbate the heat island effect? How is it going to keep our empty lots empty and our old buildings unused, and prohibit some unique adaptive reuse? So it's kind of like what Tony said at the top of the hour of, once you kind of start looking into this issue, you can't unsee it. And those are the things that we need to keep talking about this. For 60, 70 years, we took these mandatory minimums as if they're gospel coming down on, tablets from on high, and unquestioned. What's exciting about this moment right now is we are questioning those things and seeing how they have kind of warped our cities, and Phoenix's especially, and how just by undoing some of the worst aspects of them, we can really promote a positive development and affordable housing in our city, especially in our urban cores, but not just in those cores.
No, yeah, thank you for that. Sorry, go ahead. Is it Representative Ortiz?
I just wanted to add.
Oh, Kirin, sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to add that, I think that a lot of us get frustrated about and are good at kind of describing what the problem is, but there's also a message of hope, in that a lot of these reforms can be done in ways that do not have a large or any negative impact on people's life. I mean, Phoenix has an enormous amount of land. We actually have so much oversupply of parking and lots of infrastructure. And so, this isn't something that is like really, really hard to fix, or that we need huge sacrifices for. I think there's a real big message of hope here.
Yeah, I agree. And there is this concern of needing to take essentially what is described as baby steps and our incremental approaches. I saw someone put in the chat. I wanted to ask Representative Ortiz, what we heard at the Planning Commission and at some of the village planning committees is that, parking reform is great, but just for the inner corridor, but not for everywhere else. As far as the reform that City of Phoenix is proposing, the Planning and Development Department. What are your thoughts on that when you hear people describe that reform is meant just for the inner city core and not for the rest of the entire region of Phoenix?
Well, it's an equity issue, right? I think it's critical that we look at our different neighborhoods and make sure that that our resources and our needs are being met and distributed equitably, which we know for way too long, the decisions made at the city level have happened in a way that disproportionately harms Black and Brown communities. So we need to ensure that we talk about housing as the racial justice issue that it is. And when we look at the parking requirements in particular, we know that, again, the development is going to happen in a way that is best suited for the community and the neighborhood. And that is far more equitable and better for the residents in the community than arbitrary parking requirements that don't necessarily meet the needs of what every individual resident has when it comes to their transportation. And that kind of goes hand in hand with Christopher's question here in the chat about what conversations are we taking to expand and improve public transit, which is critical to this conversation, right? We had to fight very, very hard at the state legislature this year to protect the expansion of light rail. The Republicans decided to make it their target this year to attack public transportation and the people who ride it. And it's critical that we are talking about housing, public transportation, and climate as an intersection that will create a more sustainable, walkable, and equitable environment for all people. And so we are going to continue protecting and expanding public transit, especially out on the west side. You know, I live in Maryvale. We need the light rails coming to Maryvale next. And we are getting the rapid bus transit along 35th Ave. And I think we want to be prepared, right? As these developments and new housing is coming in now, we want to be prepared for the public transit infrastructure that we know is also coming. It's kind of a chicken before the egg thing. If we don't prepare as though we are ready for that public transit green energy future, then we're limiting ourselves. And we are building spaces for cars that we might not need 5-10 years down the road. So again, it goes back to data, it goes back to the needs of the community and the residents, and to ensuring equitable approaches to housing and public transit.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think also for today, something to kind of help folks digest this, if this is a new topic for them, it is understanding, Phoenix oftentimes is a leader on a policy, but on this particular topic, there's actually other large cities who have been a leader. And Tony, I actually wanted to pass off this last question to you. I think of, Minneapolis, but you would know better on some of these. Are there successful examples of cities that have already undergone significant parking reform? And if so, what lessons can Phoenix learn from their experiences in terms of implementation and managing potential resistance to change?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and great answers from all these panelists. I've been listening and answering questions in the chat, and there's good questions in there. So you've got a good team here, and I hope that you press on and make these reforms. There's a lot of questions about what exactly is going to happen, and I think one of the keys here is that these reforms really kicked off since 2016, 2017, 2018. So there's not a ton of ability to see things happen. As I mentioned, any given year, only a certain, even in a fast growing city, only a small percentage of the city is redeveloping. And these parking reforms usually mean that a fraction of that which redevelops is built in a way that accommodates a few more people, and the apartments with no parking are relatively uncommon. It can take quite a while for actually a significant amount of housing to come online with no parking. Even in Portland, when we got rid of our parking mandates in 2002, it took 10 years before anyone built anything with no parking, because the stars kind of have to align. I think looking to cities like Hartford, Buffalo, on the commercial end, there's been a lot of studies out of Fayetteville, Arkansas, transit-oriented areas in Los Angeles, the transit-oriented communities. There's usually, you can look at where these things have happened and worked, and the result is usually more housing, about the same or a little less parking that's built, better utilization of existing parking. So like one thing that happens in Hartford is there's a lot of parking in Hartford. Someone will either convert or build a new apartment building and they'll build it with less parking because they know the residents can go and rent parking at an office, you know, a former office parking garage down the street or somewhere nearby. So I think that you know, the studies that are out there, I would watch sightline.org for like continuing research on this. There's been some comparative studies at Buffalo and Seattle. But you know, and to recognize also that our cities, many of our cities grew and were built before parking mandates were in effect the first place. And you can look at how those places look to see how they might be built after parking mandates. And those are the places in most cities where everyone wants to live and or not everyone, but where a lot of people want to live and a lot of people want to go shop and do things. And to recognize that, you know, there is plenty of housing supply since we've been requiring housing to have so much parking there. If you have a car, it's not going to change. You're going to be able to find a house that has a parking space because that's pretty much every house that exists. And there's tremendous demand for housing that has less parking or is in more walkable places. So I think like the key is legalize that type of housing and start to hopefully and start encouraging it to get built.
And Tony, I had one more question for you. You know, with Phoenix being maybe a little bit hesitant, with, you know, my ear to the ground on this, right, this topic, you know, from some of the council members, have other cities implemented parking reform and did like a wait and see and kind of test it to see how, you know, how development and those concerns in opposition, how it all transpired? And do you know of any of those type of scenarios? I think I'm still thinking back to Minneapolis, but where they implemented it, they assessed it for a year, 2 years, or whatever it may be, and they found maybe there was positive changes, or maybe you know, the sky wasn't falling, for instance, right? Are there cities that have done something, for instance, like that?
Yeah, so I think that a great point here is that the city has a role to, as I mentioned in my slides, to watch and manage things. So one thing I would really recommend is that the city, we've seen this in Anchorage and in Nashville, where the cities around the same times they did reforms, they funded parking management studies or additional, they kind of funded additional capacity for the city to watch what's happening on the street and be ready to help manage that, whether that means, you know, permits that allow existing residents to park there, and new buildings have to either provide on site, or they have to, you know, people have to find parking somewhere else, or you're just managing the on-street parking a little better. That will prevent, I mean, I can tell you from my own experience in Portland, we actually took a step back a little while after these apartments first came online because the city didn't have a backup plan. So I think that you know, nothing is fully set in stone, and it takes a long time for things to change, as I keep saying. So like, you know, get started early and be prepared to actually, you know, watch and manage the situation that goes forward. And it's, I mean, if we could build buildings like that in the United States, we'd have a lot easier time solving our housing crisis. But, you know, I mean, you know, if you got rid of all your parking mandates tomorrow, I mean, well, the other panelists could probably say how long it would take for the first buildings to really come online that would really show this. And in the interim, what I think one thing we miss is the marginal benefits, right? If you get rid of these parking mandates and allow the market to kind of allow a developer to put as many, they might add 5-10 units onto an apartment building. They might still build the same amount of parking they would have had before, but you're going to get a free 5 or 10 homes in every, and if we had been doing that all along, if every apartment building in our cities had 5, 10, 15 more apartments in it, we'd be in a very different situation housing wise than we are now.
Thank you for that. It looks like we have 5 minutes left. Ed, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or comments?
Yeah, just one, thank you for putting all this together. But this really, I think sometimes as we talk to our friends and neighbors about this, and as you continue to kind of, those people that might be on the fence, continue to think about this, it's important to remember, you know, we're in a housing crisis right now. And sometimes we might fall into the thought of, it's about putting more money into subsidizing housing, and that is important. And applaud Representative Ortiz, who has done a lot of work and has successes there. But it's also about taking away the barriers to housing that we have right now. And this is something that the city can do for free. Not just the city of Phoenix, but other cities throughout the state that can do. Costs nothing, but might be one of the most important things that we can do to actually make sure we have affordable housing, workforce housing, just housing generally in our state and in our cities. And it's not going to be an overnight change. Just like the change in this city in Phoenix since when the 1950s, when they started implementing these and increasing the mandatory minimums, the kind of proliferation of empty parking lots, that wasn't an overnight change either. Getting rid of the mandatory minimums isn't going to be an overnight change. And that's for those people that want immediate change. Maybe that's not music to your ears, but for those people who are maybe a little bit worried about it, it's important to emphasize we're just allowing the market to decide and to help drive this and taking away the impediments to housing, one of the biggest impediments to housing. And we're going to keep an eye on it. You know, if things change, these mandatory minimums have not taken into account that the economy in 2023 looks so much different. Here in Phoenix, we have Waymo, we have Uber, we have Lyft, we have e-bikes, which I think are going to help change our landscapes for the better. And the mandatory minimums, in large part, are what they were in the 1970s, when we didn't have any of these things, nor the light rail, nor bus rapid transit. This is part of the modernization of our policies that are going to make city of Phoenix and hopefully our other cities that adopt these type of reforms into more livable, more walkable, more affordable cities for all of us.
Thank you. It's absolutely free. And there's no cost to implementing this. Thank you for adding that. And then Dan, do you have any brief closing thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is we keep talking about sort of the cost of the parking, but we also have to look at the cost to the city itself. So when the city mandates that someone has to build more parking, it means you need a larger parking lot. And a larger parking lot means one use is further away from another use. So that means the distances in between is further. The road is not only longer, but the water line and the sewer line underneath that road is longer. That means we all have to pay as citizens, we have to pay for the maintenance of that street. We have to pay for the maintenance of the water line and the sewer line. That cost is picked up by us, the taxpayers. And so at some point, it has to be repaired or replaced. A water line, $400 to $500 a foot to replace. Okay, so if we have 5,000 miles of road in the city of Phoenix, which is what we have, and we've overbuilt parking that extends the amount of roads we need by 5 or 10%, 10% of 5,000 is 500 miles. Okay, imagine the cost, and I can tell you what the cost is. It's over $1 billion to replace 500 miles of water line to do that. We have to pay for that. It's not just about the parking itself, but also remember that the parking is not separate from two other things, and that's lot coverage and density. If you take if you reduce parking, but you don't increase lot coverage or density, you're not going to get more on it. So you have to, those all dovetail together. So.
Thank you. And it looks like we're right at time. I apologize. I wanted to get closing thoughts from Kirin and Rep. Ortiz, but we did have a lot of good discussion today. And really in closing out, and Chelsea, if you don't mind pulling up the closing slide here with the web addresses, thank you guys so much for your time. And we just want to wish you guys a great week, rest of your week, and Labor Day holiday. And let us know what you thought about today's discussion by emailing us and reaching out to Urban Phoenix Project and the Parking Reform Network. And please visit our websites that you see up here right now. And to find our contact information, you can also visit our websites to email us and let us know if you have any other ideas for Urban Phoenix Project as far as like guest speakers, informational presentations, or more panel discussions. This is one that could be like a part 2 essentially, right? But I should note also Parking Reform Network and Urban Phoenix Project are 501c3 orgs, and we're primarily run by volunteers. So speaking, we always appreciate the support that we could get And once again, thank you. And Tony, if you got any closing thoughts, and I just want to thank everyone for your time.
No, I'll just say this is great. We're watching and cheering you on and providing whatever support we can. As I said in the chat, make sure people know, tell your friends and neighbors about the cost of parking. Tell them about how much space it takes up. You know, they might not get all in on the issue like me, but they're much less likely to oppose these policies once they understand the costs, and they are big costs. So good luck, and we're going to be watching in next week, see what happens.
Thank you guys. Take care.